Right, so this is the second SeeYou and mostly Oudie webinar. I'm Philippa Roberts. I fly at Husbands Bosworth and I have an ASW 20. I've been flying for nearly 20 years now, which seems like an awful long time. And our co-presenter this evening is Claudia.
Yes, I'm Claudia. I fly at Dunstable now, and I've been flying for about 25 years-ish. I moved countries in the middle, so everything went a bit slower for me.
And this is us, in case you hadn't seen us on our webinar. So what we're going to try and cover tonight is we're going to do a quick review of the last session. We're going to talk in a little bit more detail about setting tasks on your Oudies, changing gliders and polars so you can move your Oudie box between different gliders, which is particularly useful if you don't have your own glider. We're going to go through some of the default settings, and then we're going to have a sort of general walk through some useful settings within the Oudie. And finally, we'll finish off with some questions. So hopefully what we're going to be able to do now is share a portion of my screen and share the Oudie simulator so you can follow along. If you have your Oudie in front of you, it's really useful to sort of follow along and tap the buttons as we do, because don't know about you, but I find the best way to learn is to actually do stuff. So hopefully this will work. Let's make that bigger. Right, can we see that? Claudia's nodding, so that means we can see it. So unfortunately, due to either technical error or operator error, possibly operator error on my part, the recording of the last webinar did not get recorded, or it was corrupted. Claudia and I are going to redo it and put it on the Women Glide so you can watch the first webinar and play along with it. But actually it's not that important to have seen it to follow along with this one. So some of the things we did in the last webinar was we talked about what the screen shows you, we talked about the command buttons at the bottom, we talked about the different menu options, the different page options here, and we spoke about setting a task. But we only spoke about setting the task very, very briefly. So as hopefully this is what we'll all be doing, as flying cross country and setting tasks, we thought we would start with a brief recap on how to set a task and then go into a little bit more detail about changing some of the properties for that task. So I've got my Oudie set up so that I have the task button here. Not all of you will have that. Some of you will have a button that says, is it MAWT? Some of you have, which essentially is a button to change your display settings. If you don't have the task button there, the easiest way to get to tasks is to tap on the menu. And then on this first page there, you can click on tasks. So what I have here is 150k polygon, which is the last task that I flew. Somebody else joining us. And you can see if you, if you zoom out on my screen, you can see that task drawn out on the Oudie screen. So if you haven't got a task set in there, you can upload a task. If you've got some saved, but the easiest way is to sort of insert points as you go along. So to add a new point to this task, I click on the insert, and if you don't have a task loaded at all, this would be where you'd start it. So before I wanted to go to Northampton for sort of zigzagging around the country, if I first of all wanted to go to Bicester Control Tower, that's where I learned to fly as Bicester, then I could insert a task, insert a point there, and you can carry on going through inserting turn points like that until you have your task that you're going to fly. So as we all know, when you're flying a task, you have an observation zone which you have to fly into to complete the task, and you can set these up in numerous different ways. So this one is set up as a standard BGA FISL, but if, for example, the day was quite showery and we wanted to use showery sectors, you can change these parameters, and you can see it changes the shape of the sector, so that you can change where you need to go in these boxes to increase. So it has sort of two different parameters. You have the radius 1 and the radius 2, and the angle 1 and the angle 2. I always get confused with these and have to sort of manually change them and see what it does to the picture, because I always forget which one is angle 1 and which one is angle 2. If you're flying a competition, the task sheet that you get will show you which is which. To change the radius on these, you can either click on keyboard and then manually type in how big you want it to be, or you can click on these plus and minus arrows to manually click through. The big pluses and the big minus take it up in 1 kilometer steps, and the little ones take it up in 0.1 kilometer steps. So let's change that back to a FISL there. You'll see that we have auto next ticked there. That means that as soon as you have logged a point within that observation zone, it will automatically move on and it'll start telling you to go to the next one. If, for example, you were flying an assigned area task, which is a type of competition task where you get points for flying as far as possible in a given time. So in one of those, you will be flying through and aiming to go sort of quite a long way into one of these sectors. You don't want it to move on as soon as you've logged through. You'd be clicking the assigned area button there. We'll actually be doing a webinar later, probably towards the end of the season, on setting up for assigned area tasks. So I'm not going to go into too much detail for those now. So once you've got your observation zone, your sector set up correctly, you can click OK and go through and check that all of them are set right. So this one was obviously a showery sector at the time. Check that all set up correctly. It's a really good idea to actually manually go through and check that they're all set up correctly. I know from bitter experience in a competition that you can fly a really long way, but if you've got your sectors set up incorrectly and you just miss each turning point, by 1K, you don't get very many points, and it's a little bit depressing. So there we have our task set up. If you, sorry, I forgot to, I don't know how that happened. Sorry, I clicked on the wrong button there. If you're wanting to save that, you can then click on the tools and you can save your task. You can delete edit points like this. You can change the order of them. You can clear your task. So lots of useful things there. Now, whilst it's not too time consuming to go through and manually change each observation zone each time you insert a task, it's probably useful to have a default setting so that your sectors have a default, and then you know that you only have to change them if something's a bit different with that sector on a particular day. So the way to check the defaults is to click through onto the menu, to scroll, click on your settings, and here is where you scroll through, and you've got task here. If you click on this, this is where you can set all of your default settings for setting up a task. So you can see here we've got start lines. So if you just want it as a start line, that's where you can set the parameters for the start. A point is a turn point in the task. So you can see here I've got these set up on BJ Thistles, and the observation zone is in pink, but you can change that to any color depending on how you like it to be. And you can also set the standard settings for your finish line. So this one I've got as a 3K finish circle because I personally like to fly with finish circles. It helps me sort of work out my final glide a bit easier. So there's how you change your default settings for your task.
Philly, sorry, just one word of warning with the finish circle is that it then calculates your final glide to the edge of the circle, which is 3K away, and I've heard that that can cause problems with your final glide if you don't realize.
That is very true. It can cause problems with your final glide if you don't realize that. With all of these things, like obviously you can trust your instruments, but your instruments will only tell you what you've put in. And if you put rubbish in, you'll get rubbish out, and that might end up in a land out. Not that either of us have ever done anything silly like that. Definitely not.
No. So yeah, this rule of thumb, which a lot of you might already know, is something that I started using after some operator errors on gadgets, which is 10K per 1,000 feet on final glides. That's a reasonable rule of thumb, just to double check whether your gadget is telling you something plausible.
Yeah. It's if it looks massively wrong, the chances are it is wrong, and it's probably user error. And yeah, that 10K per 1,000 feet works for, I mean, I used to use that when I was flying an ASW 15, and I still do that now. I have my 20, and I know people in ASG 29s who use the same thing as well. So they're obviously flying more conservatively than me. I've lost my train of thought. Where was I going to go next? I've done default sector types.
Default sector type, so I guess you wanted to go through the other settings.
Yes, and also talk about polars and setting it up for you. But so we thought the next sort of good thing to go through for the sort of second part of this webinar was to just go through the settings and show you some of the stuff that the Oudie can do, which you may not have realized. You may not use them, but it's useful to know that it's there. So on the settings page, there's loads and loads of pages, and really the best way to get to know these is to just play with them and see what happens. You can always exit if you change something that you don't want to change. You can always exit the Oudie without saving and go back to your previous profile, or as we showed you last time, you can save a profile and just re-upload that if you make a mistake. But really there's not too much that you can do to make it go massively wrong. So the first thing we thought we'd talk about was IGC logging. So some of you might have IGC Oudies which you can actually use as a logger for competition flights. But even if you don't have one of those, you can get your Oudie to kick out an IGC file, which you can upload into SeeYou software on your PC. You can upload them and use them on the ladder. So it's a great way of sort of getting a record of your flight. Through this, you can, well, it's fairly self-explanatory. I normally have it auto-detecting the end of the flight, and I have my logger permanently on, so I have it creates a logbook of all of my flights, which I then use at the end of each month to fill in my actual logbook. As it shows here, you can go through and set the logging intervals, and you can also, I've not actually set up the sim properly yet, but you can save details of the pilot so that when your trace is finished, you have the pilot's name saved. You can also enter the pilot weight. If you're flying in a two-seater, your co-pilot, you can see I've got it set as my ASW 20 there. You can enter registration, comp IDs, etc. So that when your file is kicked out, you've got all of the details of that flight. And I'll show you at the end how to look at your logbook. We spoke in quite a lot of detail about the nav boxes last time. For those who missed that talk, those are the little boxes at the bottom of my screen, so these ones here. Through this menu, you can set up what nav boxes you have. Also, you can set them so that they have an action associated with them as well. So for me, because the target name is on the left-hand side of the screen, I have that associated with moving it to the previous page. And I can't remember what's on the right-hand side of my screen now because I've got a complete mental block. But if I click on the nav box on the right-hand side of my screen, that moves the page to the second map. As we said last time, but in case people have forgotten, this is a really good way of sort of sorting through all of the different nav box options. So if you know you want to include some nav boxes to help with your final glide, you can go through and click on your final glide. It's worth remembering, if you change any of these nav box settings, you're changing them for the map that you're on at the moment. So this is my map 1. If I was to change the nav boxes, it would change them on my map 1. If I wanted to change the nav boxes and the setup on my map 2, I'd have to repeat the whole process again. So go through to settings, look at the nav boxes, and you can see here that I've got different ones ticked.
And with the actions, I, for example, have assigned zoom in and zoom out. So I've got several nav boxes on the left of the screen, which all zoom out, and the ones on the right all zoom in. And then to get to the next page, I've actually got I think there is a nav box called map 1 and map 2, and that's how I flick between the pages. But yeah, you can do all sorts of stuff with that.
You just have to remember what you've done, because if you forget what you've done and you click something in flight and it does something you're not expecting,
yeah,
it can be quite disconcerting. So moving down, warnings. So a lot of us fly with our Oudies not just for logging our tasks and providing navigation, but to provide airspace warnings. So this is the setting where you can configure all of those warnings. So for example, you can change the time that it happens, you can change how far away from a specific type of airspace or particular warning sector that it gives you the warning. And you can also, when you have a warning, you can dismiss it, and you can change for how long you can dismiss it for. I also have, not that it's ever been a problem in the UK, or at least not in England. It might be in Wales and Scotland. I also have the altitude warning enabled. It's well worth, Claudia will tell you, it's well worth checking that if you find yourself not flying in England.
Yes, I had that in the Czech Republic where it was disabled and our ceiling was flight level 9.5, and I was happily going up in 10 knots. And luckily that was during the Women's Worlds, where the ground crews are allowed to tell us stuff over the radio. So suddenly Nick shouted, "Cloudy airspace."
Yeah. So yeah, it's well worth checking that if you're, in fact, it's well worth checking any of these airspace warnings if you're flying in a different country or a different type of flying to what you're doing normally. There we are. Claudia, you had something to say about input, didn't you?
Did I? I did, didn't I?
You did.
Also, what you just did there, just clicking on page to return to the settings menu, it took me, I think, about 5 years before I discovered that. I would always click on cancel and then would have to go back into the menu. So if you just click on page, then you go back to the settings menu. It's quite
yeah. And Claudia only told me that last week. As I was dumbly clicking through cancel and scrolling back through everything.
That's a problem when you teach yourself to use stuff. You come up with some weird workarounds sometimes. So that's normal. Yes, with the input I've got here, I think, I haven't tried it, I haven't had time to try it, but I think you can choose one of your files here. We've got this 2020 0720 nav, blah, blah, and then you can replay that afterwards.
You can indeed. So yeah, when you have logged all of your flights, you can go back to your logbook and choose any of your wonderful flights to reload and replay. This is particularly useful for sort of checking if you want to see where you did right or you did wrong, or wonder when you're looking at a trace going, what on earth was I doing there? Replaying it will maybe help you do that. So moving next on, the next thing we were going to talk about was the thermal assistant, which divides opinions, I think. I never used to fly with the thermal assistant. So the thermal assistant provides a guide to help you center a thermal, and it also shows you if you've got quite a lot of variance in your thermal, so you're not flying in the center if you're ovaling in and out of the center of the thermal. I still find it sometimes a little bit annoying, particularly if I'm low down and trying to center a thermal. I find having that extra information there just blows my mind, and I would rather be concentrating on keeping my speed constant and flying good thermals. But it is quite useful, and I do know a lot of pilots fly with it. If you do have it enabled, so you tick this little box here, if it is annoying you, you can just tap on it and it will disappear, which is quite good. You can change the settings for your thermal assistant here. So you can show the bubbles. The best way to play with this, because we can't sort of show you it working in a glider right now, is to try changing these settings, particularly useful if you're sort of in the start sector or flying around before a cross-country flight or just local soaring, and see what it does.
Or if you're in a two-seater, then you can let somebody else do the flying and you just play with your gadget. I always find that's the easiest way to get to know them.
Yeah, that really is. Also, if you have the thermal assist when someone else is flying, you can provide intelligent and annoying critique on their thermal centering. I love you for that.
Yeah. There is, I mean, this simulator that Philly is using here, that's free. Anybody can download it, but it's a bit of a pain to get working in the UK with the UK map if you're not that IT savvy or familiar with the structure and stuff. So yeah, there is that option, but it's a bit complicated.
Yeah. So the next thing we're going to talk through is the polar. Now, this is particularly useful if you take your gadget between gliders. So I got my first gadget before I actually had my own glider. So I was moving between OUGCs, Astia, a Cirrus that someone kindly let me fly, and a Skylark 4, which I had begged, borrowed and stolen from someone. So obviously all gliders are quite different performance, and occasionally I'd be really lucky and get a flight in the duo as well. This is a really good way of, so you can change the polar, so the information that it's giving you is specific to the glider you're actually flying rather than the glider you were last flying. So it's loads of different types of class there, but if you click on list and you can scroll through, and there is pretty much every glider you could ever want to have. I've not come across one that isn't on this list yet. And then you select the glider. Let's pretend I have a Ventus, and that'll update update all of your data so that it's giving you the right stuff. You can also modulate the pilot weight and things like that. You can check these figures to make sure they align with what you think it should be. I've never known them be wrong, but it's always possible. And you can manually edit them if you want. Units, a lot of these are fairly sort of self-explanatory, but here you can set what units you want to give all of your parameters and navbox info out in. I just click on British because I'm very unimaginative, but you could come up with some weird and wonderful metric / imperial mix-up, or you could go completely imperial. if you were feeling particularly
Imperial.
yeah, I was going to say particularly imperial, particularly rogue. If you were American, I think is the only reason you'd go all imperial. Yeah. We briefly touched on files last time, but I think it's worth just looking through them again. This is where you choose all of your different inputs into the Oudie, so your waypoints, your airspace, your terrain, etc. When I'm downloading and saving my waypoints, my airspace, etc., to put into my Oudie, I put them on a little SD card, and when you click on this, you can go through and it'll come up with all of the different potential files. As you can see, I've already got that one in there for this, and you can click on them. Sometimes if you're flying a task week or a comp, or if you're flying at an airfield with local airspace rules, they have their own airspace files or their own waypoint files, which you can upload into your device. Another really useful thing, if you're organized enough, is you can download airspace files for NOTAMs on a particular day and upload them, so it'll show you where the NOTAMs are. I'm never organized enough to do this. I find that I have far too much stuff to do on a morning of flying. I obviously check the NOTAMs and I draw them on my map, but I don't upload them to my Oudie. But yeah, so some people are more technologically savvy and better organized in a morning.
And
it's really easy, and I'd always encourage people to do it.
Okay.
And I think it's horrendous. I hate having I've started doing it and I've taken it off because it's just, I don't like having them on. It fills my screen and too many things shouting at me. And
only the significant ones, but if there are rats in place or stuff that you've really got to avoid, it's parachute jumping. It's really worth doing it.
Yeah,
that's my view anyway.
Could you maybe write down some notes for that, so we can easily follow them? You're muted.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, it's in my hand. Yeah, no problem at all. I'll do something over the next day or three.
Brilliant. Thanks, Greg.
Excellent.
With the files, also, we did discuss that in the last session. If you remember, if you connect your Oudie or GliderGuider to a computer with a USB lead, then you will see that as yet another drive, and then you can just move files to and from the Oudie, and you can save backup copies of your profiles on your computer and save airspace files from your computer onto the Oudie and stuff.
Yep. I should probably be more organized with my NOTAMs in the morning then. I do, if there are NOTAMs for a particular long week, then I will put them in.
Yeah, like last year, the parachuting the Tom Cruise thing near Calvert Junction.
Yeah, and Little Rislington with their secret squirrels.
Yeah.
So getting towards the end of the settings now. A lot of these are really sort of, as they say on the tin, so to speak. You can set the map so you can show more terrain or less terrain. I have it on a sort of medium terrain, but I think if you're flying in the mountains, then you'd probably want higher terrain. Essentially, if you've got higher terrain, it just shows more detail of what's there. And obviously, if you've got no terrain, then there's no detail of hills and mountains and things. Airspace, as we spoke about with the warnings, this shows it as so you can modify all of the different visuals for each bit of airspace. As Christina said, you don't want to be showing absolutely everything because it just makes your screen really cluttered. But obviously you do want to be showing the airspace that's important, and you don't want to be busting because it's a really good visual clue to what you're going through. I always, before a flight, actually look at my physical map and look at all of the airspace that I will be passing by or near. So I sort of already got a mental image of what will be coming up. But again, I show the important stuff on my device, and it's a really good visual clue if you happen to be drifting towards something before the warning goes off. I try to avoid there being any actual unexpected warnings because that shares have failed a little bit on my nav.
And remember from last time, those who attended the last session, you can also, if you get a warning coming up, you can mute it for 5 minutes or for today or forever, or you can tap on the map where you are, and then there's a little airspace button at the top, and it should give you the list of all the airspace that's relevant for that bit of the map. And for example, in the Czech Republic, again, we had loads of military airspace, which was disabled most of the time, but not always. So every morning we would go through the list of airspace on the actual map and disable them just for that day.
Yeah. Yeah, there's nothing more annoying than warnings going off that are actually unimportant, particularly if you're low down and struggling.
Yeah, but also if you then disable something and think, oh, I'll remember that this is here, and then you don't.
Yeah, then yeah, yeah. The story biggest one there is if, for example, you normally fly from a piece of airspace which would be prohibited, say a parachute drop zone, and then fly from a different club, you want to check that you haven't completely disabled the warnings for that parachute drop zone, because that's a really good way to get into trouble. Even if you know and you've done your radio procedures and you know you're safe, it'll give you a bad day, particularly if you're in a comp. So next one is the trace and target. Claudia, you only sort of introduced me to how useful these can be fairly recently, so perhaps you can talk through them.
Okay, yes, some of those I only fairly recently started using, and that's, well, some of them I've been using for a while, but the flight trace, for example, is quite useful if you fly in wave, because it shows you where you've been, so you can fly up and down the same bit of sky. And that's why at the moment here on the sim, it's set to 5 minutes. I think I've got mine set to 15 or possibly even 30. And then the current track vector, I find really useful to work out whether, if I'm continuing in the direction I'm flying whether I'm going to hit some airspace I'm trying to avoid. Like the other day, I was using it to check if I was hitting Hinton or not. And you can, as you can see there, you can change the colors, you can change the width of it, and do all sorts of different things.
Excellent.
And then, oh yes, and distance circle, sorry. The target is obviously where, that's drawing a line from where you are to your next turn point. And the distance circles, I usually only have them on one map and zoomed in, and they're quite useful for final glides, or to, yeah, they show you, depending on the zoom level, they go in steps of, I think, 2K or 5K, 10K, and show you circles of those.
Yeah, I find those quite useful as just a quick mental whereabouts on the circle am I. Right, I don't use LLC and FIA area. I don't know if anyone on the call does and can tell me something exciting about them, but I tend to ignore it. It's useful if you're into LLC flying and badge flights. So we went through a lot of these last time. So the menu options, I've never ever changed these. Essentially, you can change the order of which things come in the menu. Buddies and radar, if you have it set up through your FLARM, you can get your Oudie to tell you where your friends are flying if you know their FLARM radar. Again, I don't use this because my Oudie is a completely standalone, separate thing compared to the rest of my instruments. And then, yeah, so the only other thing I wanted to quickly show is logbook. This gives you a log of all your flights. So if you're carrying your Oudie and you start and finish flights and every time you fly, then this provides you with a logbook and it records all your flights. So you can see I even carry it when I'm just doing a circuit practice. I hope that was a circuit practice and not a complete fail at soaring. And you can also transfer those to an SD card. So you can transfer your flights or your settings to an SD card or from an SD card. But as we talked about last week, if you plug your Oudie in through USB in your computer, you can use it as a sort of USB drive and see all of the files. So again, you can copy your flight data and things across that way. I usually go through my sort of logbook on the Oudie at the end of each month and just use that to update my paper logbook. But if you're perhaps more technologically minded than me and keep an electronic logbook anyway, you can do all sorts of fancy things with getting it to automatically fill in electronic logbooks. So I think that's all of what we wanted to cover today, unless Claudia, have I forgotten anything?
I've just got a few things. The commands, if we could just remind people where those are in menu settings and then commands. And that is what Philly said right at the beginning, I think, where she's got the task button at the bottom of the screen. And the default is normally the display options, but of course the display options aren't called display options, they're called MAWT. And that's usually the first thing I change on the new Oudie. I change that command button, and that's the bar at the bottom of your screen with the, I don't know how many menu little symbols. Yeah, 5. Yeah.
Yes, it's this bar here. So yeah, if you want to change one of those buttons, you simply click on the one that you want to change and edit. And there are loads of different things that you could pop up. Yeah, as I have Zoom, because I tend to faff around with my Zoom quite a lot whilst flying. I have my task, go to, map changes, and obviously the menu, but you can have pretty much anything there.
Yeah. And then let's see, what else have I got? I've got symbols again in the symbols menu. Because I used to mix up symbols and commands and nav boxes, because I don't think that's all that intuitive. So yes, the symbols, you can change how the aircraft is displayed. You can change how the start box is displayed. You know, when the task, is that the task button, I think?
Yeah.
Yes. So when you cross the start line, you normally see this button, and I've got mine set to being fairly transparent, so it doesn't completely obscure that part of the map. So you can change all sorts of settings. So that's quite useful, just having a play with that. And the other thing I had was the user interface, also the settings. And the main thing that I do there really is, or wanted to point out, is the screen orientation, because I used to have the socket for the USB plug at the bottom. I guess you can't change it now because it's a SIM. I don't know, but normally you can change it. And I used to have the socket for the USB plug at the bottom, and I would forever knock it and bend it, and with my right leg or my left leg, wherever it was. And so I've now rotated the screen orientation, and the socket is at the top where I don't go anywhere near it.
Some people do fly with it in landscape mode as well.
Yeah,
I
can't.
No, I can't. They're weird, but it is a thing. If you want to join the landscape party, then that's something you can do.
Yeah, and then the fonts is another thing which we don't really need to go into massively, but just you can seriously change almost anything. Size, color, font style, and right at the top you've got the drop-down list for the items you want to change, so you can do all sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
Oh, and with the waypoints, that's another one in the settings menu.
Oh, whoops.
Again, you can also change how various waypoints are displayed. And you've got the waypoint labels there, and you can choose, for example, grass airfield or outlanding or glider site. And then depending, they're pretty much at the top there if you go to glider site or grass airfield or something. Yeah. And then on label 1, you can have the name. You can decide whether you want to show the full name or just under length. On the left, yeah, you can show the name and code or just the name, and there you can show how many letters you want to show. You can select how many letters. And label 2 has the required LD. I think somebody asked that last time, and we didn't know whether you can set that, because I had set it to my arrival height or arrival altitude. But somebody asked whether you can display the required LD to get to that grass airfield. So this is quite useful for when you're trying to work out whether you can get to that little farm strip where you know you can plonk a 15-meter glider down, that kind of thing. Obviously, your waypoint file has to have the right categories associated, but that's where you can change all that, and that's quite useful. And finally, I think for tonight, under miscellaneous, and that's just also a reminder from last time that under miscellaneous, you can manage your profiles. You can copy profiles and do all sorts of things. You can also do that when you start it up. It comes up with that window if you've got more than one profile, I think. Yeah, but if you haven't, then that's where you do it.
Yeah.
And that was it from me.
So I suppose it's, does anyone have any questions?
Can Greg ask one question?
He can.
Righty-ho. Claudia, can you just take me over the start box again, please?
Yes. Or Philly, rather, because Philly is driving me.
You're going to have to remind me where it is again.
Symbols, I think. So if you go to settings,
there we are.
Symbols, and then task button.
Task button, yes.
Yeah.
Right.
And then you can say fill transparent, or I think I've got 30% or something.
Right. I'm going to ask now, I need to ask a slightly more fundamental question about it.
Oh dear.
Clearly, when I start a task, I get asked whether I want to accept that start or not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
and we'll assume we're flying a non-AAT task. What am I using that start button? You'll have to excuse me. I'm relatively new to Oudie. I was always a well, I've been using Oudie Lite for a long time, but I've always been previously I was an XC person, and a year or so ago I put an S100 in the aircraft, and to talk to that effectively and through it to the FLARM effectively, I ended up having to adopt SeeYou, but I came to a good arrangement about that. So what is the start button all about?
It confirms the start, basically.
So
So
if you,
sorry, carry on, Philly.
I was going to say, if you don't push it, then it won't move your target on to the next next turn point.
Right, so it will still give me my, do you want to accept this start?
Yeah.
Or do you want to reject it? And if you, I think if you ignore that for a little while, the option goes away.
Yes.
But you're saying that at any time thereafter, if you continue, assuming you continue on task, you can hit the start button and your previous start will be accepted. It'll move on, it'll advance to your
It'll advance to
next
your
waypoint,
first 2P.
and then the start button disappears, I assume, does it? I can't
Yeah,
remember.
when you tap the start button, it'll disappear. Yeah.
Right.
And if you forget to press start and you've sort of already done your first TP, you can just advance to the second TP by doing the go to or clicking on the, can you do it clicking on the task and move to next TP?
Yeah, so if you click tap cancel there, and just tap on task at the bottom, then you can just highlight the next turn point and say go to. And then it continues with the task from that point.
Yeah.
And sometimes I also, when I accidentally accepted the task at the start, but I then want to go back after all,
you just go back to the start, don't you?
And I then go to task again and highlight husband's Bosworth and say go to.
And that resets it.
Yeah.
Yep.
So when you donk on that box, you end up with start settings, and it gives you an opportunity to indicate when the line opens. Is that just a sort of useless piece of information that one should?
I've never seen that before. That's interesting.
Well, mine does.
Yeah, maybe sometimes there are slight differences between versions.
Right. Okay. Well, this I think this updated the other day when I ran it, so
that might be.
But I think it's all. But I think it's always done it.
Yeah, mine does it. I do it. So you can.
What? Sorry. What?
I write it. You see, I write the start time on my hand. Maybe I'm being too simple.
I put it on my hand as well.
You mean on in the box? Yes, that's where the lines and the colons are. That's where once you've started, you've crossed the start line, it'll give you the time.
Yeah.
And then you can just read that off there. And in the settings somewhere, you can also set the Oudie to get the GPS time or whatever other time you want to use.
Right.
But yeah, I used to use WindPilot, which would acknowledge the start automatically, and I had to get used to having to press the start button. I think it might advance after a while if you don't do anything, but I'm not entirely sure. So I just press the start button whenever I'm really certain that I'm starting.
It's also, if you choose a start, if you review your flight statistics after your flight on the Oudie, if you haven't pressed the start button, it will take as your start the first time you cross the line, which makes your speed look really slow. So I was often, when I first got my Oudie, I was really depressed because it was telling me I was flying terribly slow. But
oh, sorry, your Oudie does that rather than SeeYou, which presumably
SeeYou does it properly because it has a better algorithm. But your sort of brief flight stats that I look at on the Oudie after I've flown, that only takes it from the first time you cross the start line, unless you've pressed the started now button.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? And as Philly said, we will re-record the first session where what did we do in the first one? We set a task and we showed how to modify, add and remove nav boxes, and we showed how to save, load, delete tasks, right?
Yep, and profiles.
Yeah, so we'll re-record that when we have an hour spare.
And hopefully we won't have operator error on my part.
No, I blame it on Zoom.
Yeah, it's clearly my computer's fault.
Yeah.
And can I just confirm that if I scribble some instructions down over the next 2 or 3 days, just to show how easy it is to add
Yes.
temporary airspace files? Obviously,
Yes.
you do require to be a computer to drive it, so to speak, but I tend to do it the evening before. Do I return those instructions to info@WomenGlide? Is that?
womengliding.co.uk. Yeah, it's now info@womengliding.co.uk.
It's whatever you sent this link from. Okay.
Yeah,
Yep, no problem.
which is that one. Yes.
Yeah, and then we will share that along with the recording for this.
Okay.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you.
I take it those same files can be used as airspace files in the desktop version of SeeYou.
They can, yes. Yeah.
Yes.
So is that a different way to doing it to the new SeeYou NOTAM? So you pay €16 a year, and when I plug my Oudie into the Oudie updater every day, the NOTAMs just bang down onto my Oudie.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to. Unfortunately, if I use Spline, I think it is, isn't it? And of course that gives you every captive balloon and every crane around, and clearly that will make your limited map display look a complete mess. So I tend to review the NOTAMs promptly to look for the significant ones, and I only load the significant ones. So those are likely to be parachute zones or places that you'll get into trouble for penetrating, so to speak. So rats. I mean, some of those things are done automatically now through AS Select or whatever.
Yeah.
But I tend to use it. Just typically, it's likely to be 1, 2, or 3, sort of limited areas. And it's very easy ultimately to output all of them and then search to find the 3 or 4 that you might be interested in. Cut and paste those into another copy of Notepad and save that as your daily additional file, and then you load that in addition to your sort of baseline airspace file. It is literally, it's only a few minutes effort. It's really not that difficult.
That does sound good.
Yeah, because I'm using the new SeeYou NOTAM system.
I'm far too stingy for that. I'm sorry.
So I didn't realise there was another way of doing it. So that's interesting to know. So.
Yeah, because the SeeYou NOTAM system, you can change the settings on that so that you set what type of NOTAM you want it to give you, so you can remove cranes and things. But it is a lot more faff.
Yeah, that's what I was struggling with. Yeah.
Several pints of beer by the sound of it.
Yeah, and I'm also too stingy to pay for it. I'm a Yorkshire woman at heart.
I'm an honorary Yorkshire woman, so yeah. One thing that's reminded me of is, I think I might have mentioned that last time, I also, on the grid before flying, I still check Easy VFR Basic, which is a free app for the UK. It's free for Android and iPhone, I think. Yeah. And I only came across it when the BGA suggested people should use that on their first 50K to avoid airspace. But since then, I've also discovered that you can get the up-to-date NOTAMs on it. So I use that as well, just for a last-minute check on the grid.
Yeah.
And that's obviously not for glider pilot specifically, but it gives you a really good moving map. It's a really nice, clear looking moving map.
is that an official way of checking NOTAMs, or?
I think I'll check again with the BGA, but I think it is, because I think Easy VFR Basic is actually endorsed by NATS.
Oh, cool. Okay. Nice.
What's it called, Cloud? Sorry.
It's called Easy VFR Basic.
VFR. Right. Okay. Great.
We can send a link to that
Yeah.
in the notes as well.
Yeah, the website, the URL is something slightly different, but yeah, there's a free version for the UK and for the Netherlands, and everywhere else has to pay for it, I think.
But it is very good.
Yeah.
Excellent.
So no more questions, anybody? Greg, you're muted again.
Sorry, no questions. I was just going to go and make me tea, actually.
Excellent plan. I'm also going to have
Thank
my
you very
dinner,
much.
I think.
Thanks, ladies.
Okay,
Thank
bye.
you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Really good.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.